nor to the gladiator, nor to Antinous. He had compared Terence to the Medicean Venus, but to the Saint Christopher of Notre Dame, an unshapely colossus, rudely carven, but between whose legs we could all pass without our brows touching him. 273. Not very satisfactory recognition perhaps, but the Saint Christopher is better than Voltaire's drunken savage. It is not every dramatist who treats the art of acting as seriously as the art of composition. The great author of Wilhelm Meister is the most remarkable exception to this rule, and Lessing is only second to him. It is hardly possible for a man to be a great dramatist, and it is simply impossible for a man to be a great critic of the drama, who has not seriously studied the rules, aims, and conditions of stage representation. Hazlitt, for instance, has written some admirable pages about the poetry, the imaginative conception, the language, of Shakespeare's plays, but we find his limit when he says that King Lear is so noble a play that he cannot bear to see it acted. As if a play could be fully judged without reference to the conditions of the very object with which it was written. A play is to be criticized as a play, not merely as a poem. The whole structure of a piece depends on the fact that it is to be acted. Its striking moments must be great dramatic, not merely beautiful poetic, moments. They must have the intensity of pitch by which the effect of action exceeds the effect of narrative. This intensity is made almost infinitely variable with the variations in the actor's mastery of his art. Diderot, who threw so penetrating a glance into every subject that he touched, even if it were no more than a glance, has left a number of excellent remarks on histrionics. The key to them all is his everlasting watchword: watch nature, follow her simple and spontaneous leading. The Paradox on the Player is one of the very few of Diderot's pieces of which we can say that, besides containing vigorous thought, it has real finish in point of literary form. There is not the flat tone, the heavy stroke, the loose shamble, that give a certain stamp of commonness to so many of his most elaborate discussions. In the Paradox the thoughts seem to fall with rapidity and precision into their right places. They are direct, they are not overloaded with qualifications, their clear delivery is not choked by a throng of asides and casual ejaculations. Usually Diderot writes as if he were loath to let the sentence go, and to allow the paragraph to come to an end. Here he lays down his proposition, and without rambling passes on to the next. The effort is not kept up quite to the close, for the last half-dozen pages have the ordinary clumsy mannerism of their author. What is the paradox? That a player of the first rank must have much judgment, self-possession, and penetration, but no sensibility. An actor with nothing but sense and judgment is apt to be cold, but an actor with nothing but verve and sensibility is crazy. It is a certain temperament of good sense and warmth combined, that makes the sublime player. 274. Why should he differ from the poet, the painter, the orator, the musician? It is not in the fury of the first impulse that characteristic strokes occur to any of these men, it is in moments when they are tranquil and cool, and such strokes come by an unexpected inspiration. 275. It is for coolness to temper the delirium of enthusiasm. It is not the violent man who is beside himself that disposes of us. That is an advantage reserved for the man who possesses himself. The great poets, the great actors, and perhaps generally all the great imitators of nature, whatever they may be, are gifted with a fine imagination, a great judgment, a subtle tact, a sure taste, but they are creatures of the smallest sensibility. They are equally well fitted for too many things. They are too busy in looking, in recognizing, and in imitating, to be violently affected within themselves. Sensibility is hardly the quality of a great genius. He will have justice, but he will practice it without reaping all the sweetness of it. It is not his heart, but his head, that does it all. Well, then, what I insist upon, says Diderot, is that it is extreme sensibility that makes mediocre actors, it is mediocre sensibility that makes bad actors, and it is the absolute want of sensibility that prepares actors who shall be sublime. 276. This is worked out with great clearness and decision, and some of the illustrations to which he resorts to lighten the dialogue are amusing enough. Perhaps the most interesting to us English is his account of Garrick, whose acquaintance he made towards the year 1765. He says that he saw Garrick pass his head between two folding doors, and in the space of a few seconds, his face went successively from mad joy to moderate joy, from that to tranquillity, from tranquillity to surprise, from surprise to astonishment, from astonishment to gloom, from gloom to utter dejection, from dejection to fear, from fear to horror, from horror to despair, and then reascend from this lowest degree to the point whence he had started. 277. Of course his soul felt none of these emotions. If you asked this famous man, who by himself was as well worth a journey to England to see, as all the wonders of Rome are worth a journey to Italy, if you asked him, I say, for the scene of the little baker's boy, he played it. If you asked him the next minute for the scene from Hamlet, he played that too for you, equally ready to sob over the fall of his pies, and to follow the path of the dagger in the air. 278. Apart from the central proposition, Diderot makes a number of excellent observations which show his critical faculty at its best. As, for example, in answering the question, what is the truth of the stage? Is it to show things exactly as they are in nature? By no means. The true in that sense would only be the common. The really true is the conformity of action, speech, countenance, voice, movement, gesture, with an ideal model imagined by the poet, and often exaggerated by the player. And the marvel is that this model influences not only the tone, but the whole carriage and gait. Again, what is the aim of multiplied rehearsals? To establish a balance among the different talents of the actors. The supreme excellence of one actor does not recompense you for the mediocrity of the others, which is brought by that very superiority into disagreeable prominence. Again, accent is easier to imitate than movement, but movements are what strike us most violently. Hence a law to which there is no exception, namely, under pain of being cold, to make your denouement an action and not a narrative. 279, one of the strongest satires on the reigning dramatic style, Diderot found in the need that the actor had of the mirror. The fewer gestures, he said, the better. Frequent gesticulation impairs energy and destroys nobleness. It is the countenance, the eyes, it is the whole body that ought to move, and not the arms. 280. There is no maxim more forgotten by poets than that which says that great passions are mute. It depends on the player to produce a greater effect by silence than the poet can produce by all his fine speeches. 281. Above all, the player is to study tranquil scenes, for it is these that are the most truly difficult. He commends a young actress to play every morning, by way of orisons, the scene of Athalie with Jos, to say for evensong some scenes of Agrippina with Nero, and for Benedicite the first scene of Phaedra with her confidant. Especially there is to be little emphasis, a warning grievously needed by 99 English speakers out of 100, for emphasis is hardly ever natural, it is only a forced imitation of nature. 282. Diderot had perceived very early that the complacency with which his countrymen regarded the national theatre was extravagant. He would not allow a comparison between the conventional classic of the French stage and the works of the Greek stage. He insisted in the case of the Greeks that their subjects are noble, well chosen, and interesting, that the action seems to develop itself spontaneously, that their dialogue is simple and very close to what is natural, that the denouements are not forced, that the interest is not divided nor the action overloaded with episodes. In the French classic he found none of these merits. He found none of that truth which is the only secret of pleasing and touching us, none of that simple and natural movement which is the only path to perfect and unbroken illusion. The dialogue is all emphasis, wit, glitter, all 1,000 leagues away from nature. Instead of artificially giving to their characters esprit at every point, poets ought to place them in such situations as will give it to them. Where in the world did men and women ever speak as we declaim? Why should princes and kings walk differently from any man who walks well? Did they then gesticulate like raving madmen? Do princesses when they speak utter sharp hissings? People believe us to have brought tragedy to a high degree of perfection. It is not so. Of all kinds of literature it is the most imperfect. 283. The ideas which appeared thus incongruously in the tales of 1748 reappeared in the direct essays on the drama in 1757 and 1758. We have left nothing undone, he said, to corrupt dramatic style. We have preserved from the ancients that emphasis of versification which was so well fitted to languages of strong quantity and marked accent, to vast theatres, to a declamation that had an instrumental accompaniment, and then we have given up simplicity of plot and dialogue, and all truth of situation. 284. La Motte nearly 50 years before had attacked the pseudo-classic drama. He had inveighed against the unities, against long monologues, against the device of confidants, and against verse. His assault, in which he had the powerful aid of Fontenelle, was part of that battle between moderns and ancients with which the literary activity of the century had opened. The brilliant success of the tragedies of Voltaire had restored the luster of the conventional drama, though Voltaire infused an element of the romantic under the severity of the old forms. But the drama had become even less like Sophocles and Euripides in Zaire than in Phaedra or Iphigenie. Voltaire intended to constitute the French drama into an independent form. He expected to be told that he was not like Sophocles, and he did not abstain from some singularly free railing against Euripides. The Greek pieces often smacked too much of the tone of the fair to satisfy him. They were too familiar and colloquial for a taste that had been made fastidious by the court pieces of Louis XIV. Diderot was kept free from such deplorable criticism as this by feeling that the Greek drama was true to the sentiment of the age that gave it birth, and that the French drama, if not in the hands of Racine, still even in the hands of Voltaire, and much more in the hands of such men as Lagrange Chancel and the elder Crebillon, was true to no sentiment save one purely literary, artificial, and barren. He insists on the hopelessness of the stage, unless men prepared themselves at every part for a grand return to nature. We have seen what is his counsel to the actor. He preaches in the same key to the scene painter and the maker of costumes. Scene painting ought to be more rigorously true than any other kind of picture. Let there be no distraction, no extraneous suggestion, to interfere with the impression intended by the poet. Have you a salon to represent? Let it be that of a man of taste and no more, no ostentation and no gilding, unless the situation expressly demands the contrary. In the dresses the same rule holds good. Under robes that are overladen with gold lace, I only see a rich man. What I want to see is a man. Pretty and simple draperies of severe tints are what we need, not a mass of tinsel and embroidery. A courageous actress has just got rid of her pania, and nobody has found her any the worse for it. Ah, if she only dared one day to show herself on the stage with all the nobility and simplicity of adjustment that her characters demand, nay, in the disorder into which she would be thrown by an event so terrible as the death of a husband, the loss of a son, and the other catastrophes of the tragic stage, what would become, round her dishevelled figure, of all those powdered, curled, frizzled, tricked-out creatures? Sooner or later they must put themselves in unison. O nature, nature! We can never resist her. 285. From all this we turn, for a few moments only, and not too cheerfully, to the Serbonian bog of dramatic rules and the metaphysics of the theatre. There is no subject in literature, not even the interpretation of the Apocalypse, which has given birth to such pedantic, dismal, and futile discussion. The immense controversy, carried on in books, pamphlets, sheets and flying articles, mostly German, as to what it was that Aristotle really meant by the famous words in the 6th chapter of the Poetics, about tragedy accomplishing the purification of our moods of pity and sympathetic fear, is one of the disgraces of human intelligence, a grotesque monument of sterility. The great taproot of fallacy has been and remains the incessant imputation of ethical or social purpose to the dramatist, and the demand of direct and combined ethical or social effect from the drama. There is no critic, from the great Aristotle downwards, who has steered quite clear of these evil shallows, Diderot, as we have seen, least of all. But Diderot disarms the impatience which narrower critics kindle, by this magnificent concession, coming at the close of all. Especially remember that there is no general principle, I do not know a single one of those that I have indicated which a man of genius cannot infringe with success. 286. Here we listen to the voice of the genuine Diderot, and if this be granted, we need not give more than a passing attention to the rules that have gone before, about the danger of borrowing in the same composition the shades both of the comic and of the tragic styles, about movement being injurious to dignity, and of the importance therefore of not making the principal personage the machinist of the piece, about the inexpediency of episodic personages, and so forth. The only remark worth making on these propositions is that, whatever their value may be, Diderot at any rate, like a true philosopher, generalized from the facts of nature and art. He did not follow the too common critical method of reading one's own ideas into a work of art, and then taking them back again in the more imposing form of inevitable deductions from the work itself. What Diderot conceived himself really to have done, was to have sketched and constituted a new species in the great dramatic kingdom. Every one knows, he said, that there is tragedy and that there is comedy, but we have to learn that there is room in nature and the art of the stage for a third division, namely, the genre serio, a kind of comedy that has for its object virtue and the duties of man. Why should the writer of comedy confine his work to what is vicious or ridiculous in men? Why should not the duties of men furnish the dramatist with as ample material as their vices? Surely in the genre honitit serio the subject is as important as in gay comedy. The characters are as varied and as original. The passions are all the more energetic as the interest will be greater. The style will be graver, loftier, more forcible, more susceptible of what we call sentiment, a quality without which no style ever yet spoke to the heart. The ridiculous will not be absent, for the madness of actions and speeches, when they are suggested by the misunderstanding of interests or by the transport of passion, is the truly ridiculous thing in men and in life. 287. Besides his own two pieces, Diderot would probably have pointed to Terence as the author coming nearest to the genre serio. If Goethe's bad play of Stella had retained the close as he originally wrote it, with the bigamous Fernando in the last scene rejoicing over the devoted agreement of the two ladies and his daughter to live with him in happy unity, that would perhaps have been a comedy of the genre serio, with the duties of man gracefully adapted to circumstances. The theory of the genre serio has not led to the formation of any school of writers adopting it and working it out, or to the production of any masterpiece that has held its ground, as has happened in tragedy, comedy, and farce. Beaumarchais, who at last achieved such a dazzling and portentous success by one dramatic masterpiece, began his career as a playwright by following the vein of the father of the family, but The Marriage of Figaro, though not without strong traces of Diderotian sentiment in pungent application, yet is in its structure and composition less French than Spanish. It is quite true, as Rosencrantz says, that the prevailing taste on the French stage in our own times favors above all else bourgeois romantic comedy, written in prose. 288, but the strength of the romantic element in them would have been as little satisfactory to Diderot's love of realistic moralizing as the conventional tragedy of the court of Louis XIV. The fable of most of them turns on adultery, and this is not within the method of the genre serio as expounded by Diderot. Perhaps half a dozen comedies, such, for instance, as The Ideas of Madame Aubray, by M. Dumas, are of the genre serio, but certainly there are not enough of such comedies to constitute a genuine Diderotian school in France. There is no need therefore to say more about the theory than this, namely, that though the drama is an imitative art, yet besides imitation its effects demand illusion. What, cries Diderot, you do not conceive the effect that would be produced on you by a real scene, with real dresses, with speech in true proportion to the action, with the actions themselves simple, with the very dangers that have made you tremble for your parents, for your friends, for yourselves. No, we answer, reproduction of reality does not move us as a powerful work of imagination moves us. We may as well urge, said Burke, that stones, sand, clay, and metals lie in a certain manner in the earth, as a reason for building with these materials and in that manner, as for writing according to the accidental disposition of characters in nature. 289. Common dangers do not excite us, it is the presentation of danger in some uncommon form, in some new combination, in some fresh play of motive and passion, that quickens that sympathetic fear and pity which it is the end of a play to produce. And if this be so, there is another thing to be said. If we are to be deliberately steeped in the atmosphere of duty, illusion is out of place. The constant presence of that severe and overpowering figure, stern daughter of the voice of God, checks the native wildness of imagination, restricts the exuberance of fancy, and sets a rigorous limit to invention. Diderot used to admit that the genre serio could never take its right place until it had been handled by a man of high dramatic genius. The cause why this condition has never come to pass is simply that its whole structure and its regulations repel the faculties of dramatic genius. Besides the perfection of the genre serio, Diderot insisted that the following tasks were also to be achieved before the stage could be said to have attained the full glory of the other arts. First, a domestic or bourgeois tragedy must be created. Second, the conditions of men, their callings and situations, the types of classes, in short, must be substituted for mere individual characters. Third, a real tragedy must be introduced upon the lyric theatre. Finally, the dance must be brought within the forms of a true poem. The only remark to be made upon this scheme touches the second article of it. To urge the substitution of types of classes for individual character was the very surest means that could have been devised for bringing back the conventional forms of the pseudo-classic drama. The very mark of that drama was that it introduced types instead of vigorously stamped personalities. What would be gained by driving the typical king off the stage, only to make room for the generalization of a shopkeeper? This was not the path that led to Romanticism, to André Chenier, to de Vigny, to Lamartine, to Victor Hugo. Théophile Gautier has told us that the fiery chiefs of the Romantic school who suddenly conquered France at the close of the Restoration, divided the whole world into flamboyant and drab. In the literature of the past they counted Voltaire one of the drab, and Diderot a flamboyant. 290. If it be not too presumptuous in a foreigner to dissent, we cannot but think that they were mistaken. Nothing could be farther removed at every part from Diderot's dramatic scheme, than Faust or Gotz von Berlichingen or Hernani. The truth is that it was impossible for an effective antagonism to the classic school to rise in the mind of an encyclopedist, for the reason that the encyclopedists hated and ignored what they called the Dark Ages. Yet it was exactly the Dark Ages from which the great Romantic revival drew its very life breath. In the 18th century, it has been said, it was really the reminiscence of the classic spirit which was awakened in the newer life of Europe, and made prominent. 291. This is true in a certain historic sense of Rousseau's politics, and perhaps of Voltaire's rationalism. In spite of the vein of mysticism which occasionally shows in him, it is true in some degree of Diderot himself, if by classicism we mean the tendency to make man the center of the universe. Classicism treats man as worthy and great, living his life among cold and neutral forces. This is the very opposite of the sinfulness, imperfection, and nothingness habitually imputed to man, and the hourly presence of a whole hierarchy of busy supernatural agents placed about man by the Middle Ages. Yet we cannot but see that Diderot was feeling for dramatic forms and subjects that would have been as little classic as romantic. He failed in the search. There is one play and only one of his epoch that is not classic, and is not romantic, but speaks independently the truest and best mind of the 18th century itself, in its own form and language. That play is Nathan the Wise. Chapter 8. Rameau's Nephew. In hypochondriacal moments, it has been said, the world, viewed from the aesthetic side, appears to many a one a cabinet of caricatures, from the intellectual side, a madhouse, and from the moral side, a harboring place for rascals. 292. We might perhaps extend this saying beyond the accidents of hypochondriasis, and urge that the few wide, profound, and real observers of human life have all known, and known often, this fantastic consciousness of living in a strange distorted universe of lunatics, knaves, grotesques. It is an inevitable mood to any who dare to shake the kaleidoscopic fragments out of their conventional and accepted combination. Who does not remember deep traces of such a mood in Plato, Shakespeare, Pascal, Goethe, and Diderot, who went near to having something of the deep quality of those sovereign spirits, did not escape, any more than they, the visitation of the misanthropic spectre. The distinction of the greater minds is that they have no temptation to give the spectre a permanent home with them, as is done by theologians in order to prove the necessity of grace and another world, or by cynics in order to prove the wisdom of selfishness in this world. The greater minds accept the worse facts of character for what they are worth, and bring them into a right perspective with the better facts. They have no expectation of escaping all perplexities, nor of hitting on answers to all the moral riddles of the world. Yet are they ever drawn by an invincible fascination to the feet of the mighty Sphinx of society. She bewilders them with questions that are never overheard by common ears, and torments them with a mockery that is unobserved by common eyes. The energetic, a Socrates, a Diderot, cannot content themselves with merely recording her everlasting puzzles, still less with merely writing over again the already recorded answers. They insist on scrutinizing the moral world afresh. They resolve the magniloquent vocabulary of abstract ethics into the small realities from which it has come. They break the complacent repose of opinion and usage by a graphic irony. The definitions of moral beings, said Diderot, are always made from what such beings ought to be, and never from what they are. People incessantly confound duty with the thing as it is. 293. We shall proceed to give a short account of one or two dialogues in which he endeavors to keep clear of this confusion. By far the most important of these is Rameau's nephew. The fortunes of this singular production are probably unique in literary history. In the year 1804 Schiller handed to Goethe the manuscript of a piece by Diderot, with the wish that he might find himself able to translate it into German. As I had long, says Goethe, cherished a great regard for this author, I cheerfully undertook the task, after looking through the original. People can see, I hope, that I threw my whole soul into it. 294. When he had done his work, he returned the manuscript to Schiller. Schiller died almost immediately, May 1805, and the mysterious manuscript disappeared. Goethe could never learn either whence it had come, or whither it went. He always suspected that the autograph original had been sent to the Empress Catherine at St. Petersburg, and that Schiller's manuscript was a copy from that. Though Goethe had executed his translation, as he says, not merely with readiness but even with passion, the violent and only too just hatred then prevailing in Germany for France and for all that belonged to France, hindered any vogue which Rameau's nephew might otherwise have had. On the eve of Austerlitz and of Jena there might well be little humor for a satire from the French. 13 years afterwards an edition of Diderot's works appeared in Paris, Bullin's edition of 1818, but the editors were obliged to content themselves, for Rameau's nephew, with an analysis of Goethe's translation. In 1821 a lively sensation was produced by the publication of what professed to be the original text of the missing dialogue. It was really a retranslation into French from Goethe. The fraud was not discovered for some time, until in 1823 Bry announced for his edition of Diderot's works a reprint from a genuine original. This original he had procured from Madame de Vandel, Diderot's daughter, who still survived. She described it as a copy made in 1760 under the author's own eyes, and this may have been the case, though, if so, it must, from some of the references, have been revised after 1773. The two young men who had tried to palm off their retranslation from Goethe as Diderot's own text, at once had the effrontery to accuse Bry and Diderot's daughter of repeating their own fraud. A vivacious dispute followed between the indignant publisher and his impudent detractors. At length Bry appealed to the great Jove of Weimar. Goethe expressed his conviction that Bry's text was the genuine text of the original, and this was held to settle the question. Yet Goethe's voucher for its correspondence with the copy handed to him by Schiller was not really decisive evidence. He admits that he executed the translation very rapidly, and had no time to compare it closely with the French. An identification nearly 20 years afterwards of verbal resemblances and minute references, in a work that had been only a short time in his hands, cannot be counted testimony of the highest kind. We have thus the extraordinary circumstance that for a great number of years, down almost to the present decade, the text of the one masterpiece of a famous man who died so recently as 1784 rested on a single manuscript, and that a manuscript of disputed authenticity. 295. Critics differ extremely in their answers to the question of the subject or object of Diderot's singular farce tragedy. One declares it to be merely a satirical picture of contemporary manners. Another insists that it is meant to be an ironical reductio ad absurdum of the theory of self-interest, by exhibiting a concrete example of its working in all its grossness. A third holds that it was composed by way of rejoinder to Pellicet's comedy, Les Philosophes, 1760, which had brought the chiefs of the rationalistic school upon the stage, and presented them as enemies of the human race. A fourth suspects that the personal and dramatic portions are no more than a setting for the discussion of the comparative merits of the French and Italian schools of music. The true answer is that the dialogue is all of these things, because it is none of them. It is neither more nor less than the living picture and account of an original, drawn by a man of genius who was accustomed to observe human nature and society with a free unblinking vision, and to meditate upon them deeply and searchingly. Diderot goes to work with Rameau in some sort and to a certain extent as Shakespeare went to work with Falstaff. He is the artist, reproducing with the variety and perfection of art a whimsical figure that struck his fancy and stirred the creative impulse. Ethics, aesthetics, manners, satire, are all indeed to be found in the dialogue, but they are only there as incident to the central figure of the sketch, the prodigy of parasites. Diderot had no special fondness for these originals. Yet he had a keen and just sense of their interest. Their character stands out from the rest of the world, it breaks that tiresome uniformity which our bringing up, our social conventions, and our arbitrary fashions have introduced. If one of them makes his appearance in a company, he is like leaven, fermenting and restoring to each person present a portion of his natural individuality. He stirs people up, moves them, provokes to praise or blame. He is a means of bringing out reality, gives honest people a chance of showing what they are made of, and unmasks the rogues. 296. Hearing that the subject of Diderot's dialogue is the parasite, the scholar will naturally think of that savage satire in which Juvenal rehearses the 1,000 humiliations that Varro inflicts on Trebius, how the wretched follower has to drink fiery stuff from broken crockery, while the patron quaffs of the costliest from splendid cups of amber and precious stones, how the host has fine oil of vina from, while the guest munches cabbage that has been steeped in rancid lamp oil. One plays daintily with mullet and lamprey, while the other has his stomach turned by an eel as long as a snake, and bloated in the foul torrent of the sewers. Varro has apples that might have come from the gardens of the Hesperides, while Trebius gnaws such musty things as are tossed to a performing monkey on the town wall. But the distance is immeasurable between Juvenal's scorching truculence and Diderot's half-ironical, half-serious sufferance. Juvenal knows that Trebius is a base and abject being. He tells him what he is, and in the process blasts him. Diderot knows that Rameau too is base and abject, but he is so little willing to rest in the fat and easy paradise of conventions, that he seems to be all the time vaguely wondering in his own mind how far this genius of grossness and paradox and bestial sophism is a pattern of the many, with the mask thrown off. He seems to be inwardly musing whether it can after all be true, that if one draws aside a fold of the gracious outer robe of conformity, there is no comeliness of life shining underneath, but only this horror of the skeleton and the worm. He restrains exasperation at the brilliant effrontery of his man, precisely as an anatomist would suppress disgust at a pathological monstrosity, or an astonishing variation in which he hoped to surprise some vital secret. Rameau is not crudely analyzed as a vile type, he is searched as exemplifying on a prodigious scale elements of character that lie furtively in the depths of characters that are not vile. It seems as if Diderot unconsciously anticipated that terrible, that woeful, that desolating saying, "There is in every man and woman something which, if you knew it, would make you hate them." Rameau is not all parasite. He is your brother and mine, a product from the same rudimentary factors of mental composition, a figure cast equally with ourselves in one of the countless molds of the huge social foundry. Such is the scientific attitude of mind towards character. It is not philanthropic nor pitiful. The fact that base characters exist and are of intelligible origin is no reason why we should not do our best to shun and to extirpate them. This assumption of the scientific point of view, this change from mere praise and blame to scrutiny, this comprehension that mere execration is not the last word, is a mark of the modern spirit. Besides Juvenal, another writer of genius has shown us the parasite of an ancient society. Lucian, whose fertility, wit, invention, mockery, freshness of spirit, and honest hatred of false gods, make him the Voltaire of the 2nd century, has painted with all his native liveliness more than one picture of the parasite. The great man's creature at Rome endures exactly the same long train of affronts and humiliations as the great man's creature at Paris 16 centuries later, beginning with the anguish of the mortified stomach, as savory morsels of venison or boar are given to more important guests, and ending with the anguish of the mortified spirit, as he sees himself supplanted by a rival of shapelier person, a more ingenious versifier, a cleverer mountebank. The dialogue in which Lucian ironically proves that parasitic, or the honorable craft of sponging, has as many of the marks of a genuine art as rhetoric, gymnastic, or music, is a spirited parody of Socratic catechizing and Platonic mannerisms. Simo shows to Tygiades, as ingeniously as Rameau shows to Diderot, that the sponger has a far better life of it, and is a far more rational and consistent person than the orator and the philosopher. 297. Lucian's satire is vivid, brilliant, and diverting. Yet everyone feels that Diderot's performance, while equally vivid, is marked by greater depth of spirit, comes from a soil that has been more freely broken up, and has been enriched by a more copious experience. The ancient turned upon these masterpieces of deprivation the flash of intellectual scorn, the modernize them with a certain moral patience, and something of that curious kind of interest, looking half like sympathy, which a hunter has for the object of his chase. The Rameau of the dialogue was a real personage, and there is a dispute whether Diderot has not calumniated him. Evidence enough remains that he was at least a person of singular character and irregular disastrous life. Diderot's general veracity of temperament would make us believe that his picture is authentic, but the interest of the dialogue is exactly the same in either case. Juvenal's fifth satire would be worth neither more nor less, however much were found out about Trebius. Rameau is one of the most eccentric figures in the country, where God has not made them lacking. He is a mixture of elevation and lowness, of good sense and madness. The notions of good and bad must be mixed up together in strange confusion in his head, for he shows the good qualities that nature has bestowed on him without any ostentation, and the bad ones without the smallest shame. For the rest, he is endowed with a vigorous frame, a particular warmth of imagination, and an uncommon strength of lungs. If you ever meet him, unless you happen to be arrested by his originality, you will either stuff your fingers into your ears or else take to your heels. Heavens, what a monstrous pipe! Nothing is so little like him as himself. One time he is lean and wan, like a patient in the last stage of consumption. You could count his teeth through his cheeks. You would say he must have passed some days without tasting a morsel, or that he is fresh from La Trappe. A month after, he is stout and sleek as if he had been sitting all the time at the board of a financier, or had been shut up in a Bernardine monastery. Today in dirty linen, his clothes torn and patched, with barely a shoe to his foot, he steals along with a bent head. One is tempted to hail him and toss him a shilling. Tomorrow, all powdered, curled, in a good coat, he marches about with head erect and open mien, and you would almost take him for a decent worthy creature. He lives from day to day, from hand to mouth, downcast or sad, just as things may go. His first care of a morning when he gets up is to know where he will dine. After dinner, he begins to think where he may pick up a supper. Night brings disquiets of its own. Either he climbs to a shabby garret he has, unless the landlady, weary of waiting for her rent, has taken the key away from him, or else he shrinks to some tavern on the outskirts of the town, where he waits for daybreak over a crust of bread and a mug of beer. When he has not threepence in his pocket, as sometimes happens, he has recourse either to a hackney carriage belonging to a friend, or to a coachman of some man of quality, who gives him a bed on the straw beside the horses. In the morning he still has bits of the mattress in his hair. If the weather is mild, he measures the Champs-Élysées all night long. With the day he reappears in the town, dressed overnight for the morrow, and from the morrow sometimes dressed for the rest of the week. Diderot is accosted by this curious being one afternoon on a bench in front of the Café de la Régence in the Palais Royal. They proceed in the thoroughly natural and easy manner of interlocutors in a Platonic dialogue. It is not too much to say that Rameau's nephew is the most effective and masterly use of that form of discussion since Plato. Diderot's vein of realism is doubtless in strong contrast with Plato's poetic and idealizing touch. Yet imaginative strokes are not wanting to soften the repulsive theme, and to bring the sordid and the foul within the sphere of art. For an example, time has passed, says Rameau, and that is always so much gained. So much lost, you mean. No, gained. People grow rich every moment, a day less to live, or a crown piece to the good, 'tis all one. When the last moment comes, one is as rich as another. Samuel Bernard, who by pillaging and stealing and playing bankrupt, leaves 27 million francs in gold, is no better than Rameau, who leaves not a penny, and will be indebted to charity for a shroud to wrap about him. The dead man hears not the tolling of the bell, 'tis in vain that 100 priests bawl dirges for him, in vain that a long file of blazing torches go before. His soul walks not by the side of the master of the funeral ceremonies. To moulder under marble, or to moulder under clay, 'tis still to moulder. To have around one's beer children in red and children in blue, or to have not a creature, what matters it? These are the gleams of the mens divina, that relieve the perplexing moral squalor of the portrait. Even here we have the painful innuendo that a thought which is solemnizing and holy to the noble, serves equally well to point a tray of cynical defiance in the ignoble. Again, there is an indirectly imaginative element in the sort of terror which the thoroughness of the presentation inspires. For indeed it is an emotion hardly short of terror that seizes us, as we listen to the stringent unflinching paradox of this heterogeneous figure. Rameau is the squalid and tattered Satan of the 18th century. He is a Mephistopheles out at elbows, a Lucifer in low water, yet always diabolic, with the bright flash of the pit in his eye. Disgust is transformed into horror and affright by the trenchant confidence of his spirit, the daring thoroughness and consistency of his dialectic, the lurid sarcasm, the vile penetration. He discusses a horrible action, or execrable crime, as a virtuoso examines a statue or a painting. He has that rarest fortitude of the vicious, not to shrink from calling his character and conduct by their names. He is one of Swift's yahoos, with the courage of its opinions. He seems to give one reason for hating and dreading oneself. The effect is of mixed fear and fascination, as of a magician whose miraculous crystal is to show us what and how we shall be 20 years from now, or as when a surgeon tells the tale of some ghastly disorder, that may at the very moment be stealthily preparing for us a doom of anguish. Hence our dialogue is assuredly no meat for little people nor for fools. Some of it is revolting in its brutal indecency. Even Goethe's self-possession cannot make it endurable to him. But it is a study to be omitted by no one who judges the corruption of the old society in France an important historic subject. The picture is very like the corruption of the old society in Rome. We see the rotten material which the purifying flame of Jacobinism was soon to consume out of the land with fiery swiftness. We watch the very classes from which, as we have been so often told, the regeneration of France would have come, if only demagogues and rabble had not violently interposed. There is no gaiety in the style, none of that laughter which makes such a delineation of the manners of the time as we find in Cole's play of Truth in Wine, Knife, true to nature, and almost exhilarating. In Rameau we are afflicted by the odor of deadly taint. As the dialogue is not in every hand, nor could any one wish that it should be, I have thought it worthwhile to print an English rendering of a considerable part of it in an appendix. Mr. Carlyle told us long ago that it must be translated into English, and although such a piece of work is less simple than it may seem, it appears right to give the reader an opportunity of judging for himself of the flavor of the most characteristic of all Diderot's performances. Only let no reader turn to it who has any invincible repugnance to that curious turn for wild bret, which Goethe has described as the secret of some arts. Diceres hic inter varicosos centurions, continuo crassum ride Pulphenius ingensit centum Graecus curto centus lispit. As I have already said, it must be judged as something more than a literary diversion. You do not suspect, Sir Philosopher, says Rameau, that at this moment I represent the most important part of the town and the court. As the painter of the picture says, Rameau confessed the vices that he had, and that most of the people about us have, but he was no hypocrite. He was neither more nor less abominable than they, he was only more frank and systematic and profound in his depravity. This is the social significance of the dialogue. This is what, apart from other considerations, makes Rameau's nephew so much more valuable a guide to the moral sentiment of the time than merely licentious compositions like those of Louvit or La Olas. Its instructiveness is immense to those who examine the conditions that prepared the Revolution. Rameau is not the of Aristotle, nor the creature of described by Theophrastus, the castaway by individual idiosyncrasy, the reprobate by accident. The men whom he represented, the courtiers, the financiers, the merchants, the shopkeepers, were immoral by formula and depraved on principle. Vice was a doctrine to them, and wretchlessness of unclean living was reduced to a system of philosophy. Anyone, I venture to repeat, who realizes the extent to which this had corroded the ruling powers in France, will perceive that the furious flood of social energy which the Jacobins poured over the country was not less indispensable to France than the flood of the barbarians was indispensable for the transformation of the Roman Empire. Scattered among the more serious fragments of the dialogue is some excellent byplay of sarcasm upon Polycete, and one or two of the other assailants of the new liberal school. Polycete is an old story. The Polycetes are an eternal species. The family never dies out, and it thrives in every climate. All societies know the literary dangler in great houses, and the purveyor to fashionable prejudices. Not that he is always servile. The reader, I dare say, remembers that La Bruyère described a curious being in Troilus, the despotic parasite. Polycete, 18th century or 19th century, is often like Troilus, parasite and tyrant at the same time. He usually happens to have begun life with laudable aspirations and sincere interests of his own, and when, alas, the mediocrity of his gifts proves too weak to bear the burden of his ambitions, the recollection of a generous youth only serves to sour old age. Bel esprit abhorredatus les bons esprits, il pense par la haine échappe aux prises. A force dia tentats il esse quat illuster, it es il enitate macorn, il straight ignore. Polycete began with a tragedy. He proceeded to an angry pamphlet against the Encyclopædists and the fury for innovation. Then he achieved immense vogue among fine ladies, bishops, and the lighter heads of the town, by the comedy in which he held Diderot, D'Alembert, and the others, up to hatred and ridicule. Finally, after coming to look upon himself as a serious personage, he disappeared into the mire of half-oblivious contempt and disgust that happily awaits all the poor Polycetes and all their works. His name only survives in connection with the men whom he maligned. He lived to be old, as, oddly enough, spite so often does. In the Terror he had a narrow escape, for he was brought before Chaumette. Chaumette apostrophized the assailant of Rousseau and Diderot with rude energy, but did not send him to the guillotine. In this the practical disciple only imitated the magnanimity of his theoretical masters. Rousseau had declined an opportunity of punishing Polycete's impertinences, and Diderot took no worse vengeance upon him than by making an occasional reference of contempt to him in a dialogue which he perhaps never intended to publish. Another subject is handled in Rameau's Nephew, which is interesting in connection with the mental activity of Paris in the 18th century. Music was the field of as much passionate controversy as theology and philosophy. The bull Unigenitus itself did not lead to livelier disputes, or more violent cabals, than the conflict between the partisans of French music and the partisans of Italian music. The horror of a Jansenist for a Molinist did not surpass that of a Lullist for a Donist, or afterwards of a gluckist for a pixinist. 298, Lully and Rameau, the uncle of our parasite, had undisputed possession of Paris until the arrival, in 1752, of a company of Italian singers. The great quarrel at once broke out as to the true method and destination of musical composition. Is music an independent art, appealing directly to a special sense, or is it to be made an instrument for expressing affections of the mind in a certain deeper way? The Italians asked only for delicious harmonies and exquisite melodies. The French insisted that these should be subordinate to the work of the poet. The former were content with delight, the latter pressed for significance. The one declared that Italian music was no better than a silly tickling of the ears, the other that the overture to a French opera was like a prelude to a miserere in plain song. In 1772–73 the illustrious Gluck came to Paris. His art was believed to reconcile the two schools, to have more melody than the old French style, and more severity and meaning than the purely Italian style. French dignity was saved. But soon the old battle, which had been going on for 20 years, began to rage with greater violence than ever. Pixinay was brought to Paris by the Neapolitan ambassador. The old cries were heard in a shriller key than before. Pamphlets, broadsheets, sarcasms flew over Paris from every side. Was music only to flatter the ear, or was it to paint the passions in all their energy, to harrow the soul, to raise men's courage, to form citizens and heroes? The coffee-houses were thrown into dire confusion, and literary societies were rent by fatal discord. Even dinner parties breathed only constraint and mistrust, and the intimacies of a lifetime came to cruel end. Rameau's nephew was composed in the midst of the first part of this long campaign of a quarter of a century, and it seems to have been revised by its author in the midst of the second great episode. Diderot declares against the school of Rameau and Lully. That he should do so was a part of his general reaction in favor of what he called the natural, against the artifice and affectation. Goethe has pointed out the inconsistency between Diderot's sympathy for the less expressive kind of music, and his usual vehement passion for the expressive in art. He truly observes that Diderot's sympathy went in this way, because the novelty and agitation seemed likely to break up the old, stiff, and abhorred fashion, and to clear the ground afresh for other efforts. 299, end of vol. Printed by R&R Clark, Limited, Edinburgh. Footnotes 1, ov. 18. 505, 2, ov. 18. 364, 3, ib. 379, 4, ov. I30. 5, Wolverwornschaffen, pt 2. Chapter 7. The reader will do well to consult the philosophical estimate of the function of the man of letters given by Comte, Philosophie Positive, v. 512, 6. 192, 287. The best contemporary account of the principles and policy of the men of letters in the 18th century is to be found in Condorcet's Esquisse d'un tableau, etc., pp. 187 to 189, ed. 1847. 6. Nijjan, p. 24. 7. Ove, 19. 162, 8. Ove, 19. 89, 9. Ove, 19. 93, 10. Ove, Ike Slate. 11. Marmontel, Mem, Volume 2. B7. p. 315. 12. Morellet, Mem, IP 29. 13. Ove, Ike Slate. 14. Ib. 1955. 15. Ove, 18. 376. 16. Madame de Vandel says 1744. But M. Jal, Dict. Crit. 495, reproduces the certificate of the marriage. Perhaps we may charitably hope that Diderot himself is equally mistaken, when in later years he sets down a disreputable adventure to 1744. Ove, 19. 85, 17, for an account of Madame de Pouziot in her later years, CMDME. Roland's Memoirs, I 156. 18. Saint Beuve, Causeries, 9. 136, 19, Ove, 19. 159. See also Salons, 1767, no, 118. 20. Les Regnes de Claudette de Néron, 79. 21. Account of Diderot by Meister, printed in Grimm's Correspondance Littéraire 13. 202 to 211, 22. Grétry, quoted in Jenin's Ove. Choises de Diderot, 42. 23. Marmontel, Mem, B.K. 7 Volume 2. 312, 24. Plato, Thurges, 130, c. 25, Art. Encyclopædists. 26. See Barbius Journal, 4. 166. 27. The book was among those found in the possession of the unfortunate Larba. 28. Honigers kritische Geschichte der französischen Kultur in Fluss in den letzten Jahrhunderten, pp. 267 to 273, 29. Es ist nicht gleichgültig ob ein Folge großer Gedanken in frisker Ursprünglichkeit auf die Zeitgenossen wirkt, oder ob sie zu einer mixter mit reichlichem Zusatz überlieferte Vorräte aufgearbeitet ist. Ebenso ist gleichgültig welche Stimmung, welchem Zustand der Geister ein Neulehrer begegnet. Man darf aber kühn behaupten, dass für die Wohldurchführung der von Newton angespannten Weltanschauung weder ein günstigerer Naturenlage, noch ein günstigerer Stimmung getroffen werden konnte, als die der Franzosen im 18. Jahrhundert. Langs des Materialismus, I 303. But the writer, like most historians of opinion, does not dwell sufficiently on the cooperation of external social conditions with the progress of logical inference. 30. See Montgeron's La Vérité des Miracles de M. de Paris Démontré, 1737, an interesting contribution to the pathology of the human mind. 31. Barbier, 168, 244, etc. 32. Pensées philosophiques, 18. 33. On this, see Lang, I 294. 34. Pensées philosophiques. Ov. I 128, 129. 35. Ov. 19. 87. Grimm, Sup. 148, 36. Volney, in a book that was famous in its day, Les Ruines, ou Méditation sur les Révolutions des Empires, 1791, resorted to a slight difference of method. Instead of leaving the pretensions of the various creeds to cancel one another, he invented a rather striking scene, in which the priests of each creed are made to listen to the professions of their rival, and then inveigh against his superstition and inconsistency. The assumption on which Diderot's argument rests is, that as so many different creeds all make the same exclusive claim, the claim is equally false throughout. Volney's argument turns more directly on the merits, and implies that all religions are equally morbid or pathological products, because they all lead to conduct condemned by their own most characteristic maxims. Volney's concrete presentation of comparative religion was highly effective for destructive purposes, though it would now be justly thought inadequate. See Ove de Volney, I 109, etc. 37. See on this, Lang, 2. 308, 38. De la suffisance de la religion naturelle, 5. 39. It is well to remember that torture was not abolished in France until the Revolution. A Catholic writer makes the following judicious remark: we cannot study the 18th century without being struck by the immoral consequences that inevitably followed for the population of Paris from the frequency and the hideous details of criminal executions. In reading the journals of the time, we are amazed at the place taken in popular life by the scenes of the Greve. It was the theatre of the day. The gibbet and the wheel did their work almost periodically, and people looked on while poor wretches writhed in slow agony all day long. Sometimes the program was varied by decapitation and even by the stake. Torture had its legends and its heroes, the everyday talk of the generation which, having begun by seeing Damiens torn by red-hot pincers, was to end by rending fowl on limb from limb. Kahn, Monarchie Française or 180 siècle, p. 493. 40. Lettres sur les Anglais, 23. 41. Essai sur le mérite, I 2. 3. OEUE, I 33. 42. Shaftesbury is one of the most important apparitions of the 18th century. All the greatest spirits of that time, not only in England, but also Leibniz, Voltaire, Diderot, Lessing, Mendelssohn, Wieland, and Herder, drew the strongest nourishment from him. Hettner, Literaturgeschichte des 1810 Jahrhunderts, Le Thiel. 188, see also Lang's Gesche des Materialismus, I 306, etc. An excellent account of Shaftesbury is given by Mr. Leslie Stephen, in his Essays on Free Thinking and Plain Speaking. 43, Ove, Eichsel v. 44, Jobes, France sous Louis XV, 2. 373 There were, in 1725, 24,000 houses, 20,000 carriages, and 120,000 horses. Martin's Hist. de France, 15. 116, 45. The records of Paris in this century contain more than one illustration of the turbulence of this odious army of lackeys. Barbier, I 118. For the way in which their insolence was fostered, see Saint Simon, 12. 354, etc. The number of lackeys retained seems to have been extraordinarily great in proportion to the total of annual expenditure, and this is a curious point in the manners of the time. See Voltaire, Dict. Phil, v. Economie Domestique, Liv 182. 46, Duclos, Mem. Secrets sur le règne de Louis XV, 306. 47, Ove, 19. 91, 48, Ib. p. 130. 49, Prom, du Sceptique. Ove, I 229. 50. If there is a God, he is infinitely incomprehensible, since, being without parts or limits, he has no relation to us. We are therefore incapable of knowing what he is, or if he is. That being so, who shall venture to undertake the solution of the question? Not we, at any rate, who have no relation to him. Pensies, 2. 31. 51, p. 182. 52, p. 223. 53, Barbazan's Fabliaux et Contes, 3. 409, ed. 1808. The learned Barbazan's first edition was published in 1756, and so Diderot may well have heard some of the contents of the work then in progress. 54, Nijjan. 55, in my Rousseau, p. 243, new ed. 56, Voltaire, p. 149, new ed. Globe 8vo. 57, Jalbert. 58, Hettner, Literaturgeschichte des 1810 Jahrhunderts, 2. 301, 59, Ove, 2. 260, etc., 60, Ove, 2. 258, 259. De l'Essai sur les femmes, par Thomas. C. Grimm's Corps. Lit. 7. 451, where the book is disparaged, and 8. 1. Where Diderot's view of it is given. Thomas, 1732–85, belonged to the philosophical party, but not to the militant section of it. He was a serious and orderly person in his life, and enjoyed the closest friendship with Madame Necker. His enthusiasm for virtue, justice, and freedom, expressed with much magniloquence, made him an idol in the respectable circle which Madame Necker gathered round her. He has been justly, though perhaps harshly, described as a valetudinarian grandison. Albert's Lit. Francise or 180 Sickle, p. 423. 61. Elements de la philosophie de Newton, pt. 2. Chapter 7. Berkeley himself only refers once to Schleselden's case, Theory of Vision Vindicated, 71. Professor Fraser, in his important edition of Berkeley's works, I 444, reproduces from the Philosophical Transactions the original account of the operation, which is unfortunately much less clear and definite than Voltaire's emphasized version would make it, though its purport is distinct enough. 62. Si sur l'origine des connaissances humaines, I6. 63. Let. Sur les Avgals, 323, 324. Condorcet attaches a higher value to Schleselden's operation. Ov. 2. 121, 64. Dr. M. Koch, Exam of J. S. Mill's Philosophy, p. 163, quotes what seems to be the best reported case, by a Dr. Franz, of Leipzig, and Professor Fraser, in the appendix to Berkeley, LOC quotes another good case by Mr. Nunley. See also Mill's Exam of Hamilton, p. 288, 3 DED. 65. Confessions, 2, 7. 66. Darwin, The Expression of the Emotions in Men and Animals, c. 13. p. 312, and also pp. 335 to 337. This fact, so far as it goes, seems to make against the theory of transit sentiments,